You're tuned in to Night Vision Radio, exposing the truth one secret at a time. Prepare yourself as we explore the shadow worlds of suppressed history, secret knowledge, forbidden religion, and shine a light on the conspiracies to keep it all from us. Welcome to Night Vision Radio. Hey everybody, welcome to Night Vision. So glad you could join us this evening. I'm excited about the show. Before I get into tonight's broadcast, I want to remind all you Rennies out there that we are inviting and encouraging everyone that can, to head over to Southwest France the first week of May. Just going to have a meetup. It's not a tour. There's no cost except getting yourself over there, of course. And I know that's not easy for most people. But if you can at all manage to, especially if you're a Rennes researcher or a writer or an author writing on these subjects, it might be a good opportunity to get together with some like-minded people, share your research, maybe find some missing pieces to the puzzle. Who knows? But anyway, I'll be there. I'm going to be doing a screening of Bloodline, the film that I produced along with my partner, Bruce Burgess. We're celebrating the 10-year anniversary of Bloodline, and we're going to be doing a film to commemorate that, and also in honor of our late friend, Edward Flaherty, who was our Paris producer and interpreter, and also appeared in the film. So we're not going to charge for that film. We are going to be taking donations at the door for those who would like to donate, and all those donations will be sent on to Edward's children. He has a couple of young kids in France, and we'd like to help them out as much as we can in their future without their dear dad. And anyhow, so speaking of Rennes-le-Chateau and other such mysteries, my guest tonight is well deep into that mystery, along with lots of others. And he's been on before, and I have to have him on every now and then because he just keeps going. He's like that ever-ready bunny. He just keeps on going and going and going, and he keeps coming up with new evidence all the time to either support his new theories, or to create brand new trails, blaze new trails. So you might have guessed by now, I'm talking about author and researcher and historian, I like to say, Cort Lindahl. Hey, Cort.
Hey there. Thanks for having me again, René. I appreciate it. It's good to be here.
Well, I had to, just to sort of sort out some of the most recent stuff. And, it's so interesting because, if you just take, these mysteries and these overarching mysteries and these interconnected mysteries, they're such a big area of, big subject area that it's sort of hard to sort of hone in on anything. But if you just sort of look at, the early people, the formation of our country, of the United States of America, and some of the early people that were coming over, and some of the early luminaries, including our founding fathers. It's kind of well known now that our founding fathers, a lot of them were Freemasons and involved in other secret societies. You talked a lot about the Society of the Cincinnati and some of the well-known people of our history, with the founding fathers that were connected to that. And it seems that, a lot of artists and poets seem to kind of find their way into this milieu of sort of secret society stuff. And some of those, were our most well-known American authors and poets like Edgar Allan Poe and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. So I don't know where you want to start, but another well-known name for most Americans is the name of Benedict Arnold. And when we hear that name, we always think of traitor. And most of us don't really remember the Benedict Arnold story or how it was that he ended up being called a traitor. But that name has just become synonymous. But he was not the first Benedict Arnold. And you told me a story about Benedict Arnold the first just this week, Cort, that, and you sent me something in print on that too, which I think is up on your blog, if I'm not mistaken. But interestingly, in pulling together all these sites, these landscapes and these constructions, these archaeological monuments and things like that's sort of a good place to start, is with Benedict Arnold 1 and how his odd instructions on where he wanted to be buried.
Right. Well, that's really part of what's interesting about what links all of us together with Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and possibly even Edgar Allan Poe. But what I found this week was when I was looking at really the famous quote from Benedict Arnold Sr.'s will that refers to his stone-built windmill. This is one of the only references to the Newport Tower that shows that he built it or was responsible for it being constructed. But in his request, he actually wants to be buried in alignment with the tower, and he states that in his will that he should be buried on the pathway between his dwelling and his stone-built windmill. So this was really interesting to me. I'd never closely paid attention to that before, and when I saw that, I was, this fits right into a lot of the things I'm saying. So what I did was I went and examined Touro Park, where the Newport Tower is located, and it has an interesting geometrical design that's marked by sidewalks, with the tower just to the north of this big X-shaped design made by the landscaping there. And what's interesting is if you bisect that and draw a line through the middle of it at the same angle that it points to, it points directly to Benedict Arnold's grave. So it shows that even the later people who designed the landscaping there at the park were paying attention to what Benedict Arnold said with regard to his wishes of where to be buried in relation to a specific sets of architecture, his home and the tower. And really, this really reminded me of the concept of the New Jerusalem, or the New Atlantis of Sir Francis Bacon, in which landscaping, this is part of the themes I see in early American architecture and landscaping, that they may be referring to this. And lo and behold, when I looked into it a lot more, I found a lot of similarities between the colonial capital of Williamsburg, which is one of the first linear parks in the United States or in North America, that consists of the College of William and Mary, the Burton Parish Church, and the Powder Magazine in Williamsburg, which is an octagonal structure I've written about a lot, the Colonial Governor's Mansion, and the Virginia Colonial Capitol, or House of Burgesses. So this was the... Go ahead. Just for
people that may be new to the subject and new to your material, you've identified structures, man-made structures around the planet that... particularly these octagonal structures, which create axis points which link to each other in some way, in a purposeful way. They were constructed in order to link up with other sites. Now, we don't know the full meaning of why this was. And now, when you're talking about this burial place of Benedict Arnold I being in this certain line between these two structures. Do you feel, and you talked about some of these structures, having sort of talismanic value to some of these people, or at least they wanted them to appear to. Does that have anything to do with wanting to be buried in these certain spots? There seems to be a lot of stuff to do with tombs and burial places in specific locations and, specific lines and sites. So what do you make of all that?
Well, that's true, Renee. I think really this tradition goes back to as far back as Constantine, if not to Egypt, with all the legends of, Horus's body parts being buried in different temples, creating a pilgrimage from one temple to the other. But by the time of Constantine, there is I noticed a kind of unknown there of as to the exact place he was buried. And as I, looked further in history, I came to Charlemagne, who intentionally created a mystery as to where his remains are, and included the coronation gospels. We spoke about this on the last show as well, and other, quote, Gnostic texts and relics with him that subsequent Holy Roman emperors that were descendant of him were prompted to find. And there's records of at least 4 of them doing this, including Frederick Barbarossa and Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor. So this tradition kind of links to even a Rosicrucian concept of Christian Rosenkreuz being buried in a chamber in an unknown place, including a lot of information and Gnostic hidden information and other relics that are important. So all of this kind of links back to this man in the mountain mythology. And I think that's kind of what Benedict Arnold was even referring to. If we look at this period of history, we see people being a lot more literate possibly than today, looking towards literature for entertainment and inspiration. And it's only natural that a lot of political concepts and social concepts would be written into these by the authors that made them. So Benedict Arnold possibly was no exception to the rule. And what's really interesting, as I was saying, is the similarities between the Newport Tower and the Powder Magazine in Williamsburg. And if we look at both of these structures are octagonal in the tradition of the Tower of the Winds, which I believe Constantine was also emulating this and created a mystery of his own using an octagon he may have even built on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And this later links to what I call the Arcadian mysteries in their origins, possibly in Ravenna, Italy, with the alignment of octagonal structures there and churches that even predate the building of a similar array on the Temple Mount. So throughout time, I think that sort of a representative message was being sent by all these arrays of architecture, such as we see in Washington, D.C., which a lot of people have written about. And if we really look into that, the forebearer of those is Williamsburg, and possibly Newport in a more subtle way. If you really look at what's going on in Newport, there's no sign that they intentionally at first started out to do this, but the park developed over time. The mythology and legends surrounding the Newport Tower also developed in tandem with this, and that's why it was interesting to see Arnold wishing to be buried in alignment, because I found another similar mystery in Williamsburg that I believe is associated with the Powder Magazine and the lost remains of colonial rebel Nathaniel Bacon, who was actually related to Sir Francis Bacon and other Bacon family members.
Now, you've said that a lot of these structures, especially here in the New World, were created by members of the Cavaliers. And the Cavaliers were the royalist backers of Charles I, of King Charles, and who believed in the monarchy. Is that right?
Yes, and it extends to Charles II as well. And both of them, go ahead.
So there was kind of a secret underground battle going on amongst the Cavaliers and the so-called Roundheads who were not the royalists, right?
They would have been the parliamentarians, or those that favored
the parliamentarians, right?
Right. So the Stuarts, or the King Charles and the sons of James I and grandsons, continued to be kings of England till about the turn of the 17th to 18th century, or 1600s to 1700s, and throughout this time they were persecuted in part because they were Catholics, and they still believed in the more royal prerogative where they could dictate what the Parliament would even do. So there was a big political conflict between these two groups of people, and of course the kings had this whole infrastructure of other people who depended on them for their business dealings that benefited, from government contracts of the day, so to speak, that supported these kings as well. And many of them were not even Catholic, but were associated with the king as well. But we see the Cavaliers came from the bodyguard, or the personal troops of the kings. And each time there were disputes, such as in the case when Charles I was beheaded, that a lot of these Cavaliers would be exiled in the colonies. And two of the biggest places they were exiled to was Rhode Island and Virginia. So it's interesting that in both places, during these same periods of history when these exiles were arriving, we see Governor Arnold, as far as the straight history tells it. I know there's a lot of people that think the Newport Tower is older, but really there's a lot more evidence saying that it was built during this period when the Cavaliers were coming to Rhode Island and Virginia, and the same thing could be said later of the Powder Magazine in colonial Williamsburg. And both these structures kind of harken back to the Tower of the Winds in having timekeeping and navigational attributes, as working as a fixed point on the earth from which you could navigate from. So what's terribly interesting is the octagonal array of both the Newport Tower and the Powder Magazine in Williamsburg actually points an arc on the globe to each other.
Wow.
So these structures are actually pointed to each other by their orientation and octagonal form. So this would point more to it being an affectation of these Cavaliers, or the supporters of the exiled or beheaded kings of Scotland, England, and Ireland.
Right. Well, now Benedict Arnold was the governor of Virginia, right?
He was the governor of Rhode Island.
Of Rhode Island.
Right.
Oh, right, of course.
But there are some other really interesting links between Williamsburg and Rhode Island, in that one of the early governors of Virginia, a man named Francis Nicholson, whose name will again surface later if we talk about the Burton Parish Church vault in Williamsburg, actually founded the Trinity Episcopal Church in Rhode Island, in Newport, Rhode Island. Mm-hmm. And this man actually designed the street plan of Williamsburg and Annapolis, Maryland, which a lot of landscape designers say is the direct inspiration for the National Mall in Washington, D.C. So Williamsburg really is the forerunner of what we see at the National Mall, and this governor of Virginia was the one who designed the streets that the earlier plans that inspired this. So it's really interesting, along with these Cavalier connections, that he, during the same part of the late 1600s, planned all of these cities. And he was a really interesting guy, because he's one of these, we'll go over a few people tonight whose names or families' names keep popping up at different places, of mysteries that seem to be intentionally presented to us, like Oak Island and the Newport Tower and the Bacon's Vault in Williamsburg, because Francis Nicholson was also at one time the governor of Nova Scotia in Newfoundland. So his name is associated with all of these events that could possibly be connected to the mysteries at hand that seem to have been kind of shown to us, in part, I think, through the work of these writers that I've been speaking of, have put them in the mind of the public through some of their works.
You know, after you told me the story about the burial instructions for Benedict Arnold, and I began to think about it's his grandson was the traitor.
Yes.
And I wondered, was there any kind of conspiracy around that? I mean, we always just think of him as, being this sort of horrible, repulsive traitor. And, no one ever wants to be called a Benedict Arnold. But, with all the things that were going on, all the machinations going on, you wonder if there wasn't something political about that whole thing now.
Well, there was, because Benedict Arnold, the traitor that we all know from the Revolutionary War, put himself in a difficult position with his fellow commanders. And he accused Nicholas Easton, who's also related to a governor of Rhode Island, of stealing a payroll from Fort Ticonderoga and keeping it for himself. And so really all of the problems that this later caused with him and his fellow officers is ultimately really what compelled him to go over to the British side. So there may be more reasons to it I haven't found yet, but it seems that just at each step he kind of became the goat that people didn't like, because he was trying to get them in trouble for pilfering things during wartime. And we've spoken about this before. All of that relates to another treasure legend of our friend Matthew McGurn that's also associated with a reproduction of the Newport Tower called the Stafford Hill Memorial in western Massachusetts. That also involves Henry Wadsworth Longfellow having once owned some of the property where Matthew has found clues to tell him there's a treasure there.
So there's another structure there? Another similar structure? And who built that? Do we know anything about that?
Yes, it's called the Stafford Hill Memorial because it was built to mark the gravesite of Job Stafford, who was a Revolutionary War hero as well. And he was from Newport, Rhode Island, and he was descendant of Thomas Stafford, who was the earliest windmill builder in the colonies. Right, in Newport, Rhode Island. And this is the man I suspect actually built the Newport Tower in the mid-1600s as a kind of symbol of the exiled Cavaliers that had come to Newport, Rhode Island. And this is really, it's interesting that we're even using the term Cavalier, which means knight. And we have all of this later lore of the Knights Templar, people suspect, built the Newport Tower, or the Norse had built the Newport Tower at a much earlier date. But when we look at this kind of information, there's a lot more information available that really tells you what's going on than all of the gray area that's left in suspecting that earlier people had come, where you just have to take certain parts of it on faith, and there's no actual evidence to support this. And,
I wonder what kind of property records would have been in existence in the 1600s.
Well, there's some. There are some. I mean, for instance, another man named Nicholas Easton, the forebearer of the colonel from the Revolutionary War that I was just referring to, was a governor of Rhode Island, and he built his home just a few blocks from where the Newport Tower is prior to its construction by Governor Arnold, and he never mentions a tower being there in his descriptions of the town developing. And really, that's one of the biggest arguments against the early origins of the Newport Tower, that how many thousands of colonists. I mean, by the 1650s, there was probably 70,000 people living close enough to Newport that they would know if there had been a tower there before it was built by Governor Arnold. Nobody ever mentions it in their writings, descriptions of Newport, or anything like that.
When was the first mention that you've been able to find?
Was in Governor Arnold's will.
That was it. That was the first.
Yeah, I mean, and really a lot of the things I read, even a lot of people argue that the Newport Tower wasn't even a windmill. And I believe that's possible as well, that Governor Arnold may have just built this as a folly, just like the tower at Rennes-le-Chateau or the powder magazine in Williamsburg or other similar structures, Tower of the Winds copies at Shugborough Hall and the West Wickham Estate in England. So this kind of got to be a known fad after a while, that on estates people would build these temporally sensitive monuments that referred to the Tower of the Winds in Athens. And we see even at the West Wickham Estate with Sir Francis Dashwood and the Dilettante Society, that they even wrote about these monuments and visited lots of Greek and Roman ruins and recorded the temples that they thought held these qualities, including the Tower of the Winds of Athens.
Wow. The Tower of the Winds of Athens, now, how long has that been there? When was that constructed?
The estimates are anywhere between 200 BC and 50 BC. So, wow. Yes, it's been there quite a long time, and it's just north of the Acropolis, and it's a simple octagonal tower that is known to have had a water clock in it, a clock that worked by water pressure. And this would have helped them to fix time and longitude. In association with astronomical observations, the Tower of the Winds oriented to the pole star, to true north, and a lot of people speculate that there was once a device in the Tower of the Winds similar to the Antikythera device, which measured the movements of the planets as well, using water pressure. So they would create a steady water pressure, and this ultimately would lend them in defining their domain, because they could compare other places to the star readings and the time that they had collected there using various methods. Now, this took a lot longer. After the advent of the magnetic compass, all of these things became somewhat easier to do at any time. And with other axes on the Earth, such as St. Peter's Square of the Vatican and various structures built by royalty and some of these family members even later that we see involved in Rennes-le-Chateau, this became a tradition that all had Rosicrucian overtones that even harken back, like as I was saying, to Constantine the Great, which in a lot of ways, I think he was the originator of what we consider Rosicrucian thought today.
Wow. You know what? It's time to take a quick break. And when we come back, more with Cort Lindahl and more with the making of America and other mysteries. Stay with us. Hey, and we're back. Boy, we got into such an interesting conversation on the break, we almost forgot to come back. I tell you, we were actually talking about the trip to France coming up in May, encouraging all Rennes-le-Chateau mystery buffs and researchers and writers and authors to come over and join up and have some entertainment and some. Oh, also, I forgot to mention, we're going to be showing Bloodline, the film. We're also going to be screening another film called The Other World by Richard Stanley. Now, that's going to be at a different time and possibly a different location, but we'll keep everything posted. When we start to figure out all the venues for these places, I'll be posting them on Facebook. If you're interested in going, there's a page called Rennie Union 2018 on Facebook. If you want to join that group, let me know, and I will approve you to come on in, as long as you're nice. Anyhow, but we've been talking about Rennes-le-Chateau and those mysteries, and bringing it back forward, back to the Americas again, back to, Washington, D.C., to Newport, Rhode Island, and to these other locations. And, we were talking about how there was sort of an undercurrent, well, not sort of an undercurrent, but there was an undercurrent of these secret groups sort of working at odds with each other, those that were backing the royalists and those that were backing the parliamentarians. And there was a lot of stuff going on back in those days. And a lot of our very, very prominent people, our luminaries, names from history that you've heard over and over again, they were all involved either overtly or secretly. And it's so interesting. We were talking about people like Edgar Allan Poe. Now, how does he figure into all this, Cort?
Well, Poe is a really, of course, interesting and enigmatic character. And what I found when I looked into his genealogy was amazing, because his mother's name, her maiden name, was Elizabeth Arnold.
Now, and that's crazy.
Yes, and she was from the same Arnold family descendant. I think Benedict Arnold the trader was from the 9th generation of Arnold I from England, and she was from the 11th generation, still maintaining the same last name from her family. So she was closely related to Benedict Arnold Sr. and the later trader that we know of. So that is terribly interesting when you look at kind of all the other connections that Edgar Allan Poe especially showed in the Gold Bug that he wrote, that kind of has a lot of references to Rennes-le-Chateau and Oak Island, and other stories he's written as well. Some of them are suspected to contain codes, just like the works of Sir Francis Bacon.
Progressive presents Get Pumped. Inspiration to help you do insurance stuff.
Okay, time out. You're gonna let your budget be the boss of you? Take control with Progressive's Name Your Price tool. Tell us what you want to pay for car insurance, and we'll help you find options that fit your budget. Here's some music to get you pumped. Da-dong, 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 dang, dang. I hear your budget laughing at you. Oh, wait, that's just those kids laughing at me. Ignore them! Da-dong, da-dong,
Progressive
da-dong.
Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
And there's one work of his named Eureka that if you read it, you'll have really hard time figuring it out. And there's a lot of references to Sir Francis Bacon in there and other philosophers that he admired as well. So even if we look at things like the Beale treasure, that Poe had this close relationship to the Society of the Cincinnati, I believe he was possibly a member of, but he was also part of the honored guard of the Marquis de Lafayette during his last trip to the United States. And what I've done is really even link the family of Lafayette to the Blancheforts that are part of the Rennes-le-Chateau mystery, and the de la Tour family that really are another one of these families whose name pops up continually at different sites of mystery, and everything from Rennes-le-Chateau to Nova Scotia and the Oak Island treasure and all the political intrigue surrounding that, to even Lynchburg, Virginia, associated with the Beale treasure. So he seemed to be in the know. He attended the University of Virginia at a time when President Jefferson was still alive, at which time his roommate was Robert E. Lee's first cousin, Zacchaeus Lee.
Oh, you just said something. You just said Lee. I was thinking about, and pardon the rude interruption, but I was thinking about, all the work of Edgar Allan Poe. You mentioned the Gold Bug and how it seemed to definitely have some clues in there that relate up to these mysteries. But I was thinking about, his other works, and in the chat room, and she was talking about how she loved Edgar Allan Poe, and I said, me too. My mother used to read Poe to us all the time when we were little, and my favorite was Annabel Lee, and then you mentioned Lee, and I wondered if there's something in more of Poe's works, some other secret clues that, if you read them now with what what you now know in mind. Have you tried that?
Well, yes, I'm continually working on that. Since I've discovered that these authors are involved, I've been getting my fill of Longfellow, Shakespeare, Poe, and many others. And really, that speaks to part of what I think this is all about, that the way these things work, it compels you to have to be exposed to all of this great artwork, too, which is maybe one of the goals that they have, because they know that these kind of concepts are in Poe and Longfellow that are truly American ideals, taking into account all of these legends of other countries and everything, because our American authors would have learned these from people like the Cavaliers and Jacobites who supported the fallen kings at first, and you know, as a use even in intelligence services, this could give Americans a lot of understanding as to the inner workings of royalty and gentry families in Europe. And it's just so interesting that Poe has all of these associations with Virginia, where the mysteries that I've talked about, like the Bruton Parish Church Vault, are, and the Beale treasure, and then he has this family relation direct to the Newport Tower. And it's entirely possible Poe was a member of the Society of the Cincinnati that we discussed before, that was comprised of military officers from the Revolution and one of their male descendants, which he was qualified for because his father took part in the Revolutionary War as an officer, that even some sources say worked for the Marquis de Lafayette. So he has all the right, he's in all the right places and knows all the right people, and was an artist of stature that could have contributed a lot to our understanding of these places, as well as what Longfellow did in his writings about the Norse that relate to the theories later that the Newport Tower is of Norse origins, which seems to really have political reasons that this point of view was espoused prior to the discovery of L'Anse Meadows in Newfoundland, that people knew from the Norse sagas that Vikings had been to North America somewhere, but they weren't quite sure yet, so they promoted this as a political point of view that supported even their land claims, or which culture had a claim to owning North America even before it became the United States. So a lot of this is tied up in the legal description of property and who has the right to own what, and then it becomes a silent war later of all of these people writing about it and espousing their views via literature.
Exactly. And this is why, history or the standard history that we're taught, it's just not completely reliable, because all these things were being written by whoever was in power at the time and from their political point of view. And when you go back and really start digging like what you've done, then you start finding that, maybe this was, skewed a little bit in this direction because of this political view or that political view. And then even things like, and I'm not saying that he was an innocent man, but even things like the story of Benedict Arnold have to be somewhat skewed by whoever's political views were doing the accounting at that time. And so, I think that's why the kind of work that you do is so valuable, because you just, you dig, and facts are facts. And then once you line up the facts, then you start seeing the picture.
Right.
But it takes a long time, because you've got a lot of facts that you're going through. And I know I think I talked to you for about 2 years, and it started all clicking, finally. I think maybe I'm particularly dense or something, but
right. That's why I was recently just excited to find a point on the earth where there's an overlap of all of it.
Yes.
That even is linked to Longfellow and things that he wrote. And I was amazed, because I had even written about the Isles of Scilly previously, because Star Castle is located there, which is an octagonal fort built during Elizabethan times that points directly to the Newport Tower.
Now, I have to make a confession. I did not know where the Isles of Scilly were, but they're off the Cornish coast. And if you're listening now, but not in the chat room, I've just posted a picture of a map of Cornwall and the Scilly Islands, or the Isles of Scilly, I should say. So tell us about what's the importance of that of the Isles of Scilly in this story.
Well, there's three different important overlaps to other concepts that we all enjoy, even with the Rennes-le-Chateau mystery, or that we become aware of from looking at that. And first of all, we'll be led back to Santiago de Compostela and the pilgrimage route that we were talking about during the break, via the personage of a man named Priscillian. And this man lived in the 4th century and really espoused a kind of Manichaean point of view towards Christianity, in which they had perfecti, that women could be priests as well, and a lot of things that we later see directly being associated with the Cathars.
And Priscillian was in Spain, right?
Yes, he was from Spain, and at one time was made the Bishop of Avila, Spain. That's disputed by the church today because a kind of rebel faction gave him this position. But he was really, had the kind of point of view that Christ walked as a man and wasn't divine like God was, and that's really one of the biggest divisive points through the history of Christianity, where a lot of these conflicts occurred over, including the Cathars and the Bogomils and other people who the Arian faith also had a similar point of view, that were all wiped out or eliminated over time in favor of the Latin Church. So really, if you look into Priscillian, what I found most interesting was a lot of serious scholars believe that he was interred in the crypt beneath the cathedral in Santiago de Compostela long before the cult of St. James even developed. So he may be one of the real reasons that the pilgrimage route is developed or valued in alternate ways. I mean, even in Falconelli's Mystery of the Cathedrals, they talk about this alternate value of the Camino de Santiago and St. James himself, and this may be one of the hidden things. But really what is most interesting is that Priscillian was eventually beheaded in Trier, which is on the Adriatic Sea, not far from Venice, and his remains were brought back by his followers and hidden in an unknown location. So here we go with the hidden man in the mountain type mythology again applied to this kind of Gnostic Christian figure in the form of Priscillian, who they think is interred there in Santiago de Compostela. But after his execution, all of his acolytes or disciples or other bishops that supported him, 2 of them were exiled to the Isles of Scilly, which is terribly interesting. Yes, given, subsequent events, because later we have, during the 10th century, King Olaf of Norway spending an extended amount of time in the Isles of Scilly, and after he has an encounter with a hermit in a cave, he decides to convert to Christianity. So there's some speculation out there that states even the form of Christianity that he was exposed to had been affected by these earlier Priscillianists or acolytes of Priscillian that had been exiled there. And some even speculate this explains some of the stories of Joseph of Arimathea and Christ himself coming to Cornwall. So it's interesting that King Olaf, here's a man that has direct relations to all the Earls of Orkney, to the Norwegian history of Scotland, and how that affected all of kind of the history of Henry Sinclair that everybody speculates came to North America and things like this. And here he is present in this place that I had already identified, where an axis is that was used to legally describe New England so Queen Elizabeth could claim it. So that's very interesting. And that's not all. Because seriously, later in history, the Cavaliers came to the Isles of Scilly. During the revolt, the wars against Charles I and II, the Cavaliers were driven out of England, and they took refuge in the Isles of Scilly, where they spent an extended amount of time and could have learned of this folklore there at that time, associated with both King Olaf and Priscillian. So it's amazing that after I found all this out, I found that the Cavaliers had used that as their last-ditch fortress in losing their conflict with the parliamentarians. And then after the war was over, a lot of these same men were exiled in Newport, Rhode Island and Williamsburg, Virginia.
Wow, that's just mind-blowing.
So that one place, it's really interesting, too, because the Isles of Scilly are home to a lot of megalithic features, dolmens and standing stones. And the Isles of Scilly fall on the famous Michael ley line of England as well. They're included in that part of the alignment. And interesting as well, if the Michael line, if you extend it across the North Sea, goes to Bornholm Island, the very island that Henry Lincoln points to as having the round churches and all of these navigational attributes as well.
That's
right. All along the way, this navigational theme is there, not coming just from me, but you look at the Cavaliers being there, and this is a group, that supported Charles I, that Charles I himself would have been aware of all of this. In my earlier description, or on the last show of the Arcadian Mysteries, all of that is based on the King's Knot at Stirling Castle, which was built in honor of Charles I. The King's Knot octagon points to Shugborough Hall, where we have the Shepherd's Monument, which I believe is a memento mori to Charles I, whose last words were from the book by Philip Sidney entitled Arcadia. Right. That also seems to include the original Oak Island story in the same book. If you look at all this in terms of folklore and practical views of people who used mythology and literature and artwork to communicate with each other in kind of a mystery school manner because they were being persecuted, that the Isles of Scilly become a really important point that later even Longfellow, in his Musician's Tale, wrote the saga of King Olaf and even describes Olaf's encounter with the hermit on the Isles of Scilly, and also other works like A Skeleton in Armor that relate to the Newport Tower, and poems like Evangeline that are about French Acadia. And he even wrote a poem called The Ballot of the French Fleet, which refers to the failed Duc de Roquefort d'Anville's expedition to invade the colonies, in which he passed away and was interred on an island in Halifax Harbor in Nova Scotia. And this was recently featured on the Oak Island, Curse of Oak Island TV show, because the name Roquefort appears on the, quote, Cremona document map that they've been looking at there.
The Zena Halpern map.
Correct.
Yeah. You mentioned that this navigation theme just keeps coming up over and over again. It reminds me that in the Priory of Zion, there was an office called Nautinier, which is a navigator.
Right. And that's the same term in Mystery of the Cathedrals by Fulcanelli that is applied to those that have been initiated. So I can't stress that enough. Mystery of the Cathedrals is an interesting book that's hard to read, but you have to read it over and over, including the introductions to the book. and there's direct references where he's just telling you that this is the way things work.
And I think
which is interesting again too, because this relates us to the Debadia family, who were also involved in the development of French Acadia, and then later famous for the great cyclic Cross of Vendée mystery that we've talked about before on our show with Laura Lamberti, and how that all relates as well. So it just seems at every turn there's people creating monuments with great meaning that also seem to have geographic qualities or directional attributes.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, that book, Mystery of the Cathedrals by Falconelli, if I'm not mistaken, I think that's online. I think you can read it online for free, can't you?
Yes, there's a PDF of it available. If you just word search for it, you'll see a couple of different places where you can read that. Yeah.
I hate reading online, but it is good because you can do searches and find certain terms and things like that, and look things up and reference things much easier that way. Yeah. But it's nice that it's available there. I'd like to have a hard copy of it myself, though. But now, with all this, well, we're going to have to take another break here in just a minute, so I don't want to get off on too much of a subject area. But when we go back to Poe and Longfellow, now, were there a lot of clues, do you think, in the writings of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow?
Yes, definitely. He's telling you stories that directly relate to all of the kind of movement to suggest that the Norse had come to North America before they were aware of L'Anse aux Meadows. And so they wanted to promote this idea because they knew or felt that it was true because of what was in the sagas, indicated that people had been there. And what's interesting is the people that had been here all really have the heaviest relation to the Norwegian culture of Scotland. So that kind of fits in later with how it could be appreciated by the Cavaliers and Jacobites, who all supported the more Scottish-oriented monarchy that was exiled.
Right.
So throughout the whole time, you see them developing these kind of themes in their work. If you read the saga of King Olaf, even the language in there includes a lot of the terms that are present on the Kensington runestone.
Crazy.
like scaries, and some of the stories of the passages in the saga of King Olaf refer to voyages of discovery, and as I said, they use similar terms such as the scaries that are on the Kensington runestone that Longfellow had probably been introduced to all of these things by his friendship with an interesting man named Ole Bull. And that's an interesting play on words for a name because it's spelled O-L-E and his last name is Bull. So it's the Norwegian name Ole Bull. So they had a good sense of humor, possibly his parents did. But this Norwegian Bull family is actually descendant of King Olaf. And Ole Bull was one of the most famous violinists of the mid-19th century in Europe. And he was close friends with Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And Mr. Bull even attempted to start what was termed the Bull Colony, or the Ole Bull Colony in Pennsylvania, which was a Norwegian colony during the 1850s. So he introduced Longfellow to a man named Christian Raffin, who was the first scholar to actually write that he suspected the Newport Tower was of Norse origins. And Longfellow was also friends with a man named Eben Horsford, who had created the Norumbega Tower in Boston and espoused a theory that there was once a heavily populated Norse colony in the Boston area, which a lot of this was later disproven. The examples he tried to present as being Norse culture were just earlier colonial affectations, and a lot of people immediately pointed out that these were politically motivated movements, kind of to discredit Columbus and give the Norse the credit that they did deserve, and other things in the United States even possibly the Kensington runestone were part of this kind of movement just to promote that point of view as opposed to all of these things actually being real. So Longfellow's friendship with both of these men in relation to the kind of mythology we see at the Newport Tower, in coupled with the movement of the Cavaliers and Jacobites, suggests that this was all just something that was created to promote their views on culture and politics at the time.
Wow. Well, that sounds like a good place to take a quick break. And when we come back, more with Cort Lindahl and more of the mysteries. Hang in there with us. Welcome back to Night Vision. If you're just joining us, we've been talking tonight with Cort Lindahl. He's an author and a historian, a researcher of the great mysteries. His specialty is looking into connections between structures and features and landscapes around the world and the secret history behind those and the families that are sort of interconnected to all those structures. And boy, do they tell a story. Another site that you talked about often, and we've heard about often in terms of something secret being buried and some great mystery, is in Williamsburg, Virginia. And we've talked... what's the latest on that, Cort?
Well, the latest is really interesting, and I have to stop and give credit where credit is due for a moment to Marie Bauer Hall, who investigated the Burton Vault mystery in Williamsburg in the 1930s.
The wife of Manly P. Hall, right?
Correct. And we know Manly P. Hall wrote extensively about the Rosicrucian overtones of the origins of the United States. And you can see this, actively at play in her theories about what happened in Williamsburg. And really, there's a legend there. There's two men named Nathaniel Bacon that were actually cousins to each other, that were from the same Bacon family as Sir Francis Bacon. They were related directly to the same sources going back through the Bacon family that Sir Francis Bacon was from. And the legend states that the first Nathaniel Bacon had brought a stash of Sir Francis Bacon's papers to Jamestown, and that they were hidden in a vault beneath the Jamestown Church, which I recently visited as well, which was very interesting and fun to do. And eventually it was moved to the Bruton Parish Church in Williamsburg, which is an Episcopal church, just like where I found other mysteries happening in association with in Newport and Edenton, North Carolina as well, which is the colonial capital of North Carolina for a while. Mm-hmm. But the whole myth that she deduced that there was an original Bruton Parish Church that was torn down, and then the new one was built at around the turn of the 1600s to the 1700s.
On the same site?
Yes, only the
same site.
Very close, within yards of each other.
Mm.
And she actually determined from looking at old maps that the old foundation was located where the graveyard is now. And it was interesting because she found a tombstone there from a man named James Nicholson, and his dates of birth and death matched the distance to the old foundations of the church in feet when measured from Wren Hall on the campus of William and Mary, which was designed by famous Masonic architect Christopher Wren. And so that seemed more than a coincidence. And as I dug into that, I actually found out that Thomas Jefferson himself was associated and friends with James Nicholson, who was the gardener and steward of the College of William and Mary and attended the Bruton Parish Church as well. And I found records even of Thomas Jefferson giving him an undisclosed amount of money the year before he died. So this led me to the thought that maybe he actually paid for the tombstone to contain this information, when in reality he just may have been buying seeds from Mr. Nicholson. But it's also interesting that Nicholson shares the same name with the governor, Francis Nicholson, who I stated before had designed the street plan of Williamsburg in its linear array, which I believe refers to the New Jerusalem and New Atlantis concepts of kind of opposing views, in philosophy and religion, and maybe possibly even Rosicrucian thought at that time. So it's really interesting that Miss Hall had figured this out after she was only able to view a map of Old Williamsburg, one of the original maps that included the name of Francis Nicholson on the map. So that was interesting in relation to her theory revolved around a book of symbols that was written by a man named George Wither, who was friends and part of the circle of Sir Francis Bacon. And this book consists of a lot of etchings and interesting engravings that are all symbols and have Greek and Latin sayings that come with them, and a passage of poetry. And it's what I found as I dug into that the book was divided into 4 parts, each dedicated to a different person, or the King Charles was one of the parts, the Duchess of Richmond, but amazingly, one of the quarters of the book was dedicated to Philip Herbert, who is the nephew of Philip Sidney, who wrote Arcadia.
Wow.
So that was an interesting crossover, and in the back of the book even infers a kind of game where certain passages are selected by the reader, and then you can compare them to another index in the back of the book that is in turn compared to a windrose illustration that harkens us back to the Tower of the Winds and the true function of the powder magazine in Williamsburg, that has each quarter of the wind dedicated to the same person that the portions of the book are dedicated to. So in the book, Philip Herbert is the north wind, and he is also one of the subjects of the dedication of the first folio of Shakespeare that, we all know Peter Admonson. He's been on your show as well, as deciphered many things from that book. And so it's interesting that she...
Hi, it's Jamie, Progressive's Employee of the Month, 2 months in a row. Leave a message at the... Hi, Jamie. It's me, Jamie. I just had a new idea for our song about the Name Your Price tool. So when it's like, tell us what you want to pay, hey, 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 and the trombone goes, wah, 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 and you say, we'll help you find coverage options to fit your budget. Then we just all do finger snaps while a choir goes, savings coming at ya, savings coming at ya. Yes? No? Maybe? Anyway, see you at practice tonight. I got new lyrics for the rap break.
Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
Had all these theories that there were illustrations in the book that related to Williamsburg. And those are kind of more open-ended, but I think she could be right. Even one of the illustrations displays a hog that is a common reference to Sir Francis Bacon, and other scenes in the book and the etchings seem to even depict the streets of Williamsburg. So even though this is interpretive, I think her instincts were right, and she seems to have been influenced by an English man named Cunningham that tipped her off to all of this. And then she later kind of became obsessed with it and spent a few years in Williamsburg working with the rectors of the church and the Rockefeller Foundation that was at that time restoring the colonial capital to what it had originally been. So as all of this progressed on, it was just terribly interesting. I looked at the family of Nathaniel Bacon and discovered that even 2 of the descendants of the elder Nathaniel Bacon had worked for President Jefferson at Monticello, managing the estate for a 30-year period. And we know that Sir Francis Bacon is one of Jefferson's 3 most admired people. He even owned a painting or portrait of Sir Francis Bacon as part of his art collection, which is really interesting, and we've been able to tell a lot about that because he owned a copy of Magdalen Penitent as well, and other paintings that are associated even with George de la Tour, who painted a rendering of the same subject matter, going back to our de la Tour connections to Nova Scotia, France, and even Virginia later. So as I started to look into this, I linked it all to Bacon's rebellion in Virginia, which was an interesting happening, whereas in Nathaniel Bacon rebelled against the kind of more loyalist faction of colonists there that were working things to their advantage. So over time in Virginia, at first, a lot of people came as indentured servants. The people who lived there would pay for people to come over and subsequently get the land that they were due by coming to be a colonist. Right. And these people would have to serve a term of indentured servitude. So about the time of 1676, coincidentally 100 years before the Revolution, Nathaniel Bacon staged this revolt against the powers that be because a large population of these freed indentured servants had found themselves now in the colonies landless and having much less of an advantage than the landed gentry did. So here already at this early period in the colonies, we're seeing a division based on gentry and land ownership and wealth that kind of follows the pattern through American history to the Revolution. So Nathaniel Bacon even wrote a declaration of independence, so to speak, stating all of the reasons that he was revolting against Governor Berkeley at the time, who was part of the more loyalist faction. But ultimately, Nathaniel Bacon passed away while the revolt was still going on, and the whereabouts of his remains are unknown. So we see even President Jefferson having a great admiration for Nathaniel Bacon, and even it's postulated, and some of his comments reveal that he wrote the Declaration of Independence partially inspired by Nathaniel Bacon. And it's terribly interesting, too, because the family that donated the land where the Burton Parish Church was built is the Page family. And they were heavily related to the Randolph family of President Jefferson's mother. So he actually had Page family members that were cousins and close friends of his while he was a student at William and Mary. And he was even said to have drafted the Declaration of Independence at the Pages Rosewell Mansion in Gloucester, Virginia, not far from Williamsburg.
Wow.
This is in the same area where Nathaniel Bacon supposedly passed away.
And we don't know what happened to his body.
Right. So we're seeing another man in the mountain mystery developing here, that even in the Octagonal Powder magazine, which I think is part of this mystery, includes a stained glass window of Nathaniel Bacon. And this is the structure I just described as pointing to the Newport Tower, and the Newport Tower pointing back to, and I believe Nathaniel Bacon's remains are somewhere pointed to by the Powder magazine in Williamsburg.
That's so strange. But, in talking about Burton Parish Church and Mary Palmer, what's her name? Hall. You said that she figured out that where the location of the original foundation of the original church was, and it happens to be where the cemetery is located now. She located this grave, and somehow the dates of the birth and death, add up to this measurement of the church. I mean, that's pretty amazing that she even. Did she look at every headstone and try to figure out if there was something in every single thing? And, if there was this precise measurement denoted on this gravestone, who was this guy in this grave, or was there really a guy in the grave? Have they ever opened that grave at all?
No, not that I know of. But to me, it's fascinating that his name is the same as the governor who designed the street plan, and everybody credits even for the design of the National Mall in Washington, D.C. being a copy of what he did. So here we have this landscape portion of it that this gentleman was once the governor of Nova Scotia and also founded the church in Newport, Rhode Island, that he has a connection to many of these places too, where these kind of intentionally contrived mysteries seem to be presented to us, where we may examine them, find these facts, and really start to get a feel for what is really being told. And that's why it was amazing that Miss Hall was able to discern all of this in the age before the internet. I keep saying if she had the internet, she would have nailed this right away.
Oh, man.
With no problem at all, because she did so well at it just with what she had. And let me add real quick here, too, Philip Herbert was the daughter of Mary Sidney, Countess of Pembroke, who was the sister of Philip Sidney. Okay? There is a conspiracy theory that Sir Robert Dudley and Queen Elizabeth are actually the parents of Sir Francis Bacon. And this was espoused by Manly P. Hall and Marie Hall. You know, some people believe this, others don't. I mean, there's enough mystery with Sir Francis Bacon that we don't need him to be the illegitimate child of Queen Elizabeth. But later, when Charles I was about to be beheaded, Philip Herbert was the liaison to Charles I between Parliament and him, and Philip Herbert actually ended up owning the first folio copy that Charles I, the King of England, had once owned. The very book that was in part dedicated to him. And if the conspiracy theory is true that Robert Dudley and Queen Elizabeth were the parents of Sir Francis Bacon, this would have made Philip Sidney and Mary Sidney, the Countess of Pembroke, Sir Francis Bacon's first cousins. So that is very interesting in relation to all of the intrigue with the first folio, the Herbert brothers, you know, who both married the daughters of the 17th Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere, who is another prime suspect that people point to as having been involved in the production of Shakespeare.
That's right.
So all of this in Williamsburg is a reference to that, but I think ultimately what we're supposed to learn is about the missing remains of Nathaniel Bacon. And there has been quite an effort in modern times to try to locate Nathaniel Bacon's grave. And I really think that was probably the actual mystery that Miss Hall was onto, and just didn't have enough information to discern that. Wow.
Now, you know, most of us have heard, or a lot of us have heard of Manly P. Hall, and especially here in Los Angeles, you know, there's the Philosophical Research Society that, you know, he's so well known for here. I actually saw Manly P. Hall when he was still alive over at the PERS. I saw him speak one Sunday. But, you know, few people know or have heard much about Mary Palmer Hall, or at least, you know, I didn't know much about her. What is her background? And how is it, do you think, that she was able to get so far in her research?
Well, it's an interesting story. She was from a privileged background, and she began to take classes and study at the library of the Philosophical Research Society, and that's how she became involved with Manly P. Hall. But the story goes is that one day she just happened to find a copy of George Wither's Book of Symbols, an original copy, in the library. And from talking to this English person, Cunningham, that she started to suspect that it had some relation to Nathaniel Bacon and Bacon's vault in Williamsburg. And really that part of it's not clear, and that's part of the mysterious part about it, how she was drawn to Williamsburg and Nathaniel Bacon, because it's really kind of an obscure path of clues that would lead you to something like this. So really what's inferred is somebody, possibly Mr. Cunningham, had knowledge of this kind of cavalier culture that I was telling you about, where they created conundrums like this. We know Thomas Jefferson attended the College of William and Mary, attended the Burton Parish Church, He had seen the powder magazine and created 2 structures later himself, or 3 structures later, that were very similar to the octagonal form of the powder magazine. So I think he had been told this or initiated into this, and I think possibly even Thomas Jefferson is behind the entire mystery, because he would have been aware of the significance of the Herberts and the Sidney, Arcadia, the works of Shakespeare. All of that would have been something that was taught to him at the College of William and Mary, and he would have recognized, even as a land surveyor, what the powder magazine actually represented in establishing a prime meridian in this new colony, or the New Atlantis or New Jerusalem that had been established by England. So Thomas Jefferson, the brilliant, created codes of his own. He was kind of the spy master of the Revolutionary War, an early intelligence figure in American history, who had all the cultural background, spending time in France with the Marquis de Lafayette at all the literary salons, at Chateau Villette, featured in the Da Vinci Code. He hung out there with the Marquis de Lafayette and Sophie de Grouchy and her husband, the Marquis of Condorcet, that was also a really well-admired philosopher and one of the founders of the French Academy of Arts and Sciences as well. So this is a crowd that Jefferson was running in, that included all of these deep thinkers, people that kind of espoused the later French Revolution, that believed France should be a republic as well, that were later, kind of forced to sit out the Napoleonic era until they could actually create a republic like the United States and France. So it's very interesting that all these things are linked together, even going back to Poe, who had an association with Marquis de Lafayette, and we see his family relations to Rennes-le-Chateau. So it's just the more this information piles up and we keep saying the similar names, the families, all of the same philosophies involved from mystery to mystery, really kind of leads me to the fact or the conclusion that even the Stuart family is one of the driving forces behind it. And even at Rennes-le-Chateau, we see the wife of Henry V, the Duc de Chambord, who was the exiled king of France in the mid to late 1800s. His wife was directly descendant of the Stuarts, and even is one of the people who is said to be in line for the exiled Jacobite throne of Scotland. So even at Rennes-le-Chateau, we see kind of this convergence of the exiled kings, leaving us stories and mythology that also relates to older mythology. This doesn't negate any of the older myths of treasure being there, or something like the temple treasure or the remains of Merovingian kings or anything like that. But these are things they would have been aware of and built their own mythology on top of that. So that it's just a wide-ranging thing where the connections are so numerous that it's beginning to be hard to ignore the fact that they're all connected together.
It really is. It's just crazy how it all turns out. Well, I hope we can get you over to France in May, Cort.
That'd be fabulous. Thank you all. You guys, stop.
You'll go crazy.
Oh, I would probably just wouldn't know how to act, I'm sure. It would just be incredible.
Well, gosh, it's been great having you on. Now, tell us a little bit about your latest book and how we can find you online, how we can find your videos and your books.
Sure. All my books are available on Amazon now. I'm up to 6 books, and the latest one is Oak Island and the Arcadian Mysteries, Oak Island, Rennes-le-Chateau, and Shugborough Hall Revealed, because those were the first 3 where I saw the commonalities of the Arcadian theme involved, and those are all available on Amazon. And I'm constantly publishing new articles. Usually most of the book ends up on my blog for free before I publish it, so check out survivalcell.blogspot.com for a lot of articles that even relate to my last book, as in things I discovered that related to all of that after I'd already published the book, like the fact that Virginia was named Arcadia on the Verrazano map, the same one that points out Norman Villa as being the Newport Tower. And we didn't get a chance to talk about that, but Virginia is Arcadia as well. So I found that interesting in relation to the story I just told about Bacon's rebellion and the Sir Francis Bacon influence in Virginia.
Wow. That is crazy. Now, you've got your YouTube videos, you've got your books, and you've got your blog. So there's plenty of information out there that you can tap into. And also, Cort's on Facebook as well. So you might
go ahead and holler me there on Facebook if you have any questions or want me to straighten out something that you don't understand from the interview. That's fine.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I'm always working on more. There's always something else.
Oh, I know. I was just
finding more today about my California material that I was looking at too. That it was amazing, and so there's always it's never ending. And so I was telling my friend Stephen Sindoni that there's always more.
There always
no matter how much you find, there's always more. And he's a great friend. You've had him on the show before.
Yes,
and
sure have.
He's a friend of mine that kind of goes farther out on a limb as far as the mystical, more New Age oriented things. But we hung out there in Mount Shasta this summer for a few days and got to know each other and came to terms with our differences. And Stefan's done a lot of great historical research as well. And he has some great stories there that actually link to the Frenchman's Tower and all of the things I found at Mount Shasta, too. So everybody check out Stephen Sindoni as well.
Great. Oh, man. I guess we've got about a minute to go. I just got the sign from MJ, our wonderful producer, who I never thank enough on the air. I always thank him afterwards because I forget while we're on the air. But I want to say thank you to MJ for the wonderful job that he does. He's one of the station owners, and he is our producer here on Night Vision Radio. We love him to death. So also, I think MJ is going to try to get over to France the first week of May. Hope to see you all over there. If you're there and you see me, come up and say hello. And you'll see me running around there. I'm all over the place when I'm there. So we'll be having a couple of events that we'll be scheduling, and we'll have some signs up there. But also check that Facebook page, Rennie Union 2018. And sign up in the group. I'll accept you, and you can get all the latest on anything that we have planned coming up. Well, I want to thank you, Cort, once again for coming back on and edifying us with all of your great information. I think my head's about to explode, but it always does when I talk to you, so that's nothing new.
Well, thanks a lot. And thank you, MJ. I appreciate it. I really do.
All right, MJ.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Thanks so much, everybody. Love you.